Hello, practical law students. So we are on lesson 2 for this week. We are continuing with our topic of crimes against the person. In lesson 1, we looked at homicide and suicide. And with homicide, you have two big categories. You have criminal homicide, and then you have non-criminal homicide. And under criminal homicide, based on certain conditions, certain details, you have murder, you have first degree murder, you have felony murder, you have second degree murder, you have voluntary manslaughter, involuntary manslaughter, and negligent homicide. Now, with criminal homicide, one of the big things is there's intent or a plan to cause loss of life, or your actions are so reckless that they are deemed that you have a general disregard for human life. Non-criminal homicide is, of course, excusable or justifiable, not subject to criminal charges, and we talked about some exceptions to that, okay, or some definitions for that, namely killing in war, if you're protecting yourself or someone else, or cases where a police officer kills a suspect who is actively committing a crime or endangering others. That would be non-criminal homicide. So today we're going to pick up with crimes against the person. We're going to be looking at kidnapping, assault, battery, robbery, and rape. Okay. Now let's start with kidnapping. And again, as we go through these, be sure you are jotting down your own notes. I will try to give you a heads up with certain things that I want you to copy down, but feel free to take whatever notes that you want. Okay. I should point out that before we get into kidnapping, we are going to talk more about robbery, really with crimes against property. Robbery is difficult because you are taking property, but you are taking property from the person. Okay, so that's why I said we'll deal with robbery more when we get to crimes against property. So back to kidnapping. Okay, kidnapping is referred to as unlawful imprisonment or abduction. Okay, that's the definition. Now, originally, it was called kidnapping because it involved children. Okay, it was stealing children to serve as servants or workers. But over time, we realized actually, anytime you imprison somebody or you abduct somebody, no matter what their age is, that is kidnapping. So today, it now applies to victims of all ages. Okay, and basically, what it is taking a person away against that person's will. Okay. Now, if you take a person away against their will and you cross state lines, that's going to be a violation of federal criminal law. So other charges might result. Okay. So if you're just taking a person, away against their will, you're keeping them in the same community, that's one thing. But if you cross state lines, if you cross international boundaries, then that's going to open up a whole new level of charges against you. Okay. But the unlawful imprisonment or abduction of somebody against their will, that is kidnapping. Okay. Now let's talk about assault and battery. Assault is any attempt or threat to carry out a physical attack upon another person. Okay. Notice it's an attempt or threat. If you go through with that attempt or threat, now it becomes battery. Battery is any unlawful physical contact inflicted by one person upon another without consent. Actual injury is not necessary. The only requirement is that the person must have intended to do bodily harm. Please be sure that you get both of those definitions down, okay? The threat or attempt to carry out physical attacks, that's the assault. The actual unlawful contact without consent, that is the battery. So it's important to remember that there are different classifications for assault and battery. The charge is often defined by the harm inflicted, not necessarily the intent, but the harm inflicted. There are also separate statutes for assault with intent to rob and assault with intent to murder. Okay, because those are other serious crimes. So not only do you have the threat, but the threat is going to lead to another serious crime. So those are going to be separate charges altogether. Assaults typically result from arguments between people who know each other. A lot of times we see it as rage triggered by alcohol or jealousy, which leads to violence. Serious injury or death often depends on the presence of a weapon. Okay, and hopefully this is some common sense things that we're talking about here. Stalking occurs when a person repeatedly follows or harasses another person and makes threats, causing the victim to fear death or bodily injury. So, this is a form of assault. When you are repeatedly following somebody and making threats against that person, causing them to fear death or bodily injury, that is a form of assault. Stalking is a form of assault. Now, when it comes to stalking, women are mostly the targets. That's not always the case, but women are most often the targets. And we have a series of anti-stalking laws to criminalize stalking and harassment. Okay, and these laws have broadened to include electronic communication, which is known as cyber stalking. Okay? At one point in time, stalking was difficult to prosecute, but now that it falls under the umbrella of assault, okay, and we have anti-stalking laws in the books, we're taking a more proactive approach to prosecuting those found guilty of stalking. Another interesting caveat under assault and battery is bullying. Bullying is a version of assault and battery in which peers or acquaintances intimidate or put others in fear. Okay, now remember, once you get moved through with the threat and you actually physically touch somebody, then we get the battery involved. Okay, it causes harm to victims, witnesses, and perpetrators. And it is seen as a gateway behavior. A lot of your more serious criminals, if you go back in their history far enough, you will find that in school they were considered bullies. Okay, now bullying is very, very controversial because it is still very, very difficult to define. Okay, um, and if you ask a bunch of different experts in the field, you're going to get a bunch of different definitions as to what actually constitutes bullying. But it's peers or acquaintances intimidating and putting fear in others. Okay, that's the general definition. Now, under assault and battery, there's a whole nother subcategory, and that is sexual assault. Okay, sexual assault is a specific type of assault that can include rape or attempted rape. It includes a wide range of victimization, from verbal threats of a sexual nature to unwanted sexual contact between the victim and the offender. So, rape would fall under sexual assault. It's probably the most serious form of sexual assault. But verbal threats would also fall under this category as well. Okay. You can be found guilty of sexual assault if the attack is either completed or attempted. Okay, so even if it doesn't go all the way through, you can still be found guilty of sexual assault. Okay, contact without consent might include grabbing or fondling and may, but does not have to, involve force. Okay, now, as I was saying, the most serious form of sexual assault is rape. Rape is defined as sexual intercourse without consent. There is an aggregated form of rape that occurs when the perpetrator uses a weapon or some other form of force to compel the victim to have intercourse. Okay, so if you force somebody to have sexual intercourse with you, you're going to be charged with rape. If a weapon is involved, that becomes aggravated rape. Okay. Then you have statutory rape, which is intercourse with someone under the legal age of consent, and this varies from state to state. Rape is considered the most serious form of criminal sexual assault. It requires a lack of consent on the part of the victim, no consent if the victim is unconscious or mentally incompetent, or if the victim's judgment is impaired by drugs or alcohol. Okay, so this happens a lot at parties. Okay, um, people get drunk, drugs are involved, or whatever, and then sex occurs. You can still be charged with rape because the victim's judgment is impaired by drugs or alcohol. Okay, even if you think they consented to it, because drugs and alcohol are involved, it can be considered rape. Okay, back with statutory rape. Um, Statutory rape, there's a lack of consent. Lack of consent is not an element of the crime. Okay, a minor is incapable of giving legal consent. So statutory rape is kind of controversial as well, because if two underage people are having sexual intercourse, and you see this happen a lot, one of the people can be charged with statutory rape because they're both minors, and minors are incapable of giving any legal consent. Okay, so oftentimes what you see a boyfriend and girlfriend, they end up having sexual intercourse. Okay, consent might have been given, but because they were both minors, it is still considered statutory rape. And a lot of times you will see parents who might be upset with the choice of boyfriend or girlfriend, wanting to pursue those charges in court. Okay, even if technically consent was given, but because it's a minor, it's still considered statutory rape. There is a trend in several states not to charge a person with statutory rape unless the perpetrator is several years older than the victim. Okay, so there is a trend in that direction. The age difference requirement is never used to define forcible rape. Okay, that is an important caveat to know. So if it's a minor forcing another minor to have sex, it is still rape. Okay, it is still rape. Age difference is never used to define forcible rape. Okay. You have more severe punishments for certain forms of sexual assault, like if the victim's under a certain age, that's statutory rape. If they're over a certain age, if they're disabled, or like I said, if you're threatened with a weapon, that's an aggravated form of sexual assault. Okay, so again, like we saw with homicide, there are certain conditions that can lead to more serious charges. Okay. In the past, defendants in rape cases were allowed to present evidence to the jury about the victim's past sexual behavior and reputation in order to show that he or she had probably consented to the act. Okay. And this is an interesting situation in what we consider the rights of the accused. Okay. At one point in time, the defendant, if the accuser, okay, if the plaintiff, all right, had loose morals or had a reputation as being loose or something like that, the defendant could bring that out in court. Okay. Over time, though, we realize that is not necessarily the case. Okay. Let's say a person has a very loose reputation or loose morals. That does not mean that rape could not occur. Okay. So today, we have rape shield laws that prohibit such evidence from being introduced. Okay. Today, there needs to be other proof that the act took place. Okay. And that other proof is needed for conviction. So you have confirmation of or support for the account provided by the victim. That includes testimony of a witness, a doctor's report, sexual intercourse took place, or a prompt report to the police. Okay. So at the same time, all right, while your personal history is no longer brought into court, Today, you need proof for conviction, okay? Which is why it is so important that if you have been raped, that you report it immediately, okay? That we get rape kits done at hospitals and things like that that can be used to convict a person of rape. There is a trend to be more protective of victims. It is the defendant, not the victim, that is on trial, which is why you have those rape shield laws that you're not supposed to enter in somebody's previous personal history as evidence. Okay. That being said, the unclear nature of relationships presents unique challenges for the criminal justice system. While we want to protect the victim, we also want to avoid punishing an accused person unless the victim clearly expressed a lack of consent. Okay. Now, that being said, I think it is important to point out that when drugs or alcohol are involved and stuff like that, we tend to err on the side of the victim. Okay. That maybe they did not have their full mental facilities available to express consent, okay, or lack thereof. All right. So it is a very, very delicate balance. We're trying to protect the victim, but we're also trying to make sure that before we convict a person of rape, that there's enough evidence to go forward. Okay. Because rape is one of those crimes that you do not come back from. All right. That you're going to carry that charge with you for the rest of your life. Okay. Now, that being said, at one point in time, you could argue, well, this happened a lot. Okay. Husband and wives that were married. Okay. Can a husband rape his wife? The answer is yes. Okay. We now have acquaintance rape or date rape, which is sexual assault by someone known to the victim. Okay. So this would fall, the husband and wife situation would fall under acquaintance rape. All right. And yes, if you have sex with your wife and your wife does not give you consent, that could be considered rape. Okay. And vice versa. All right. If you have sex with your husband or force your husband to have sex and he is not given consent, that is considered rape. Okay. So acquaintance rape or date rape is a sexual assault by someone known to the victim. Again, this is one of these situations where we want to make people aware of all the different categories and all the different classifications, because many victims do not report the assault because they do not realize that an attack occurs on a date or social encounter that can constitute rape. This is one of the big problems with this is, much like suicide, it's important to remember we need to empower the victim to come forward and so that we can prosecute these crimes, okay, and that we can protect the victim and go after the perpetrators, because sadly a lot of times they do not get reported, either because they're ashamed or because they don't realize that what has occurred is considered rape or sexual assault. Okay. Now, those are the big ones when it comes to crimes against the person: homicide, suicide, assault, battery, and rape. Okay, these are the big ones against crimes against the person. Where we're going to head later this week, and the last lesson for the week, is now we're going to start talking about crimes against property, and we'll be there this week and then next week as well.